Hello, this is Conversations with Sebastian Galliani, episode 83. Our guest today is Esteban Rossi-Hansberg. Esteban is the Glenn Lloyd Distinguished Service Professor at the Department of Economics of the University of Chicago. Esteban specialized in international trade, regional and urban economics, as well as organization economics. With him, we'll be talk about the future of globalization, urban economics, cities, climate change, and pandemics. Hello, Esteban. How are you?
Hello, thanks for the invitation.
Please, thank you for talking to me today. So before we jump to talk about your very interesting research, why don't you tell us about your academic trajectory?
Okay, so I'm Mexican, so I studied in Mexico. I grew up there, and I went to a university in Mexico called the ITAM, Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México. And I was kind of lucky that at the time ITAM was going through a little bit of transformation to become like a more academic institution in the sense of research and putting an emphasis on economic research. And, around those years, they created a new research institute, the Centro de Investigación Económica, as part of ITAM. And so I went into as an economist to study economics, and I benefited from that effort that Alejandro Hernandez and other people there were doing to try to gear ITAM towards this kind of more research-oriented trajectory. And so they, as part of that effort, they hired a bunch of academics, including Manuel Santos, Fernando Zapatero, and others that we're doing real research and we're trying to publish internationally, etc. And I learned from them, worked for them, and they motivated me to follow an academic career and go do a PhD. And I went to Chicago to do my PhD, and there I was initially inclined on following on the footsteps of Fernando Zapatero, who was one of the professors there that I had worked for as an RA. And he was doing finance, kind of asset pricing and, developing asset pricing models. So I went to Chicago with a little bit of an idea of following finance, but then as many times in PhDs, when people go do a PhD, and this is kind of my advice for all the undergrads that want to follow this type of career, is you need to allow yourself to be influenced by the environment that you're gonna encounter. And that was exactly my experience at Chicago. I went there, I was influenced by all the people that were there at Chicago, by both the faculty, but also my peers, and that ultimately made me geared towards macroeconomics. And in particular, I started working with Bob Lucas on theories of the structure of cities. And then, from there, I started thinking about space and kind of the role that space has in the economy. And, my dissertation was focused on that. And, since then, I've done a lot of work on those type of topics. My first job then was at Stanford. I was at Stanford for a few years. Then I moved to Princeton, and most of my career, I spent most of my career there for 16 years. And since 2021, I'm in Chicago.
Great. Anyway, so you mentioned spatial economics, which is something you've done a lot of research, very quantitative models. So can you explain us exactly what is spatial economics studies, and what do we know about spatial economics?
Yeah, so there's a relatively long tradition in economics, thinking about cities and the role that cities and the play in economic activity in general. And the key aspect of cities is that they concentrate economic activity. So if you look at the distribution of economic activity in space, the most striking characteristic of that distribution is that it's extremely concentrated in space, right? So even though there's vast amounts of space, most people and production happens in very few areas of the world. So 90% of economic activity happens in about 10% of the space on Earth. And so that tells you that it's for economic activity to occur, and for individuals to live the lives that they want to live, they want to be close to each other. They want to be concentrated in space. There seem to be important advantages of that concentration, as evident from that distribution. And so urban economics in general, but spatial economics more generally, has tried to think about why is that the case, first of all, and then what does that imply in terms of the different characteristics of an economy, whether those characteristics lead to that concentration or not, whether that matters for the level of productivity in an economy or output in an economy, or also the extent to which we're going to have productivity growth, or more general growth, economic growth in an economy. And so spatial economics, kind of in a very broad perspective, tries to think about what is the role that the distribution of economic activity has on economic outcomes. And so to do that, to study that, the main approach has been to think about people and firms in space. They are located in a particular area, and then they interact with other people and firms, where the distance from others matters. And it matters because it's costly to transport goods in space. It matters because moving to some other location is costly, both because you may need to commute to go to work, and that it takes time, but also because if you want to move to a different location, to go live in a different location, people tend to move to places that are closer to where they are. And the same with ideas. We see that the diffusion of ideas and the diffusion of knowledge more broadly has a kind of an important spatial component, in the sense that it tends to be diffusion tends to happen more smoothly close by. And so all those kind of interactions happen across space. And so we want to try to think about those interactions, kind of how important they are, what prevents them from operating in a way that is cost effective, and then build that up to an aggregate economy, right? So rather than starting from an aggregate economy, think about all those kind of underlying interactions of individuals and firms and governments and infrastructure and other characteristics in space, and then think about how that configuration matters for aggregate outcomes. And so that's the field. Then that's the effort that I've done, in my different research papers or research lines, research projects, is try to kind of go through that agenda and develop their conceptual models, then develop quantitative models of those interactions, and also bring in the data to be able to estimate and quantify those models in the most accurate way possible.
Right. One may think that, yeah, then given the description you just gave us, cities will be very persistent, right? Once they get developed, at least they get a shock, a very large shock in which the main activities stop being competitive. Probably they will be important for long periods of time, but then also new cities develop. For example, let's say just Tel Aviv has like 100 years and it's a very vibrant city. So what is that drives these new cities?
Well, one important component is clearly industrial fluctuations and changes in technology. So the classic example that I like to give about this is, Detroit versus San Jose. So Detroit was obviously, the great city of the American industrialization, the home of the car industry, grew tremendously, in the first part of the 20th century, and it was kind of the one of the big cities and key cities in the U.S. economy. And then it went in decline, and it's a decline that it's surprising in the sense that starting in the 60s and 70s, there's no construction in Detroit at all anymore. So if you look at, say, new housing permits in the city of Detroit, they are zero, right? Since then, and they have been zero for many decades. And so this is an story of boom and bust of a city that is very dramatic. And then the city went into bankruptcy, so it has gone through many problems. And then at the same time this was happening in Michigan and Detroit, there's a city like San Jose that was a small city in California, close to San Francisco, right? But then, of course, became the center or one of the center cities for the high-tech boom. And so this city then, developed from being a very small city, some small town, to one of the biggest cities in the US. And so you have these, old cities that are decaying at the same time that another city is being created from scratch. And the interesting thing I think about this is that it's in the same country. So some sort of basic naive argument would tell you, well, why not? Let's just use the whole infrastructure and all the urban development that has happened already in this city, in Detroit, right? Rather than building a whole new city from scratch. But that's clearly not what happened, right? So we have this decline and this growth at the same time in different cities. And then, of course, there's also, the in particular countries and given particular political circumstances, cities that can develop because they, have a configuration of either, parts of the government that can help it and can, are central to its operation, or sometimes, and maybe this is more the case of Tel Aviv, have the right combination of being sufficiently isolated of certain problems and at the same, concentrate kind of a booming industry as San Jose. So you get these kind of particular combinations that lead to booming cities at the same time as some others are declining. But the point, I think that it's interesting also, is that this all happens even though there is this city creation and there is this growth in certain locations. It happens in this very concentrated way, right? It doesn't happen in this dispersed way. And the extent to which that that concentration is allowed, is fostered. It's important for the extent to which these cities can, generate prosperity in an economy.
Right, right. Right, and cities like countries, trade a lot, and you did work also on trade, and I want to switch to that topic. A very interesting work you did is about the cost of deglobalization, which right now is a very hot topic. Some people think that we are going to a new Cold War. I don't know about that, but certainly it seems that we are going to be in a war where the peak of globalization maybe has passed, at least in the near future. So I would like to ask you, what will be the cost really of the globalization more concretely, and why they will happen?
Well, I mean, I think one has to be a little bit careful in not over interpreting some of these trends. I mean, so it is true that after a period of very rapid globalization, the growth in, say, trade over GDP in the world economy has slowed down, and that there's some indication that trade is, if not contracting really, it has stopped growing. But there's also a question of to what extent we could really keep going on that trend, right? I mean, there was this big period of globalization, but this continuous increase in the trade to GDP ratio was also unsustainable. That is, eventually it has to slow down, just because there's only so many things that you can trade.
Mm-hmm.
So there is definitely a slowdown there, but I'm not sure that indicates that this is all reversing. I think more problematic from the perspective of globalization and the extent to which that's the level at which we are right now is gonna be kept, or we're gonna keep trading at that level or not, is the undermining and the consistent undermining that we've seen from the international trade institutions. So the WTO in particular, and the fact that after so many years of building this international trade system, where the WTO played this crucial central role, right now it's losing its ability to regulate trade in the world, partly because the US, but others as well, are going outside of that rule-based system to impose tariffs and impose trade policy based on some notion of national security, or hidden behind some notion of national security, or imperative to produce certain goods because our geopolitical rivals may concentrate parts of that production chain, or part of the core materials, or part of the core products, intermediate products that go into those goods. And so to me, that's the clearer signs, more than in the volumes of trade, etc., that we've been seeing so far, is in the undermining of those international institutions. And so that seems like a real problem that is hurting now, but it's also probably gonna hurt international trade for several decades to go, because forming those multilateral institutions where there's where this kind of incentive structure where it's better for everyone to have the institution, but unilaterally you may want to deviate by setting up your own optimal tariffs. It's very hard. You really need a lot of coordination to set up that type of institution. And so once you break it, it's very hard to build it back up. So that to me, it's a big problem. On the other hand, you have, of course, the whole technological aspect of trade, right? And the fact that that we're trading a lot of things that are less and less, physical goods that we have to send and put in a ship and send along. And so the fact that, the technology has allowed us both to, produce knowledge and different types of aspects of goods that are not physical goods, but that can be traded easily across space through, information networks and kind of information and communication technology. That also kind of expands the interactions and the ability to use the work and the knowledge from different parts of the world. So there's kind of institutions are kind of deteriorating, but if you look at trading services and if you look at offshoring of labor services, etc., that it's expanding partly because the technology to do that better has improved a lot. And so that part there, I don't see retrenchment from globalization at all. What I see there is, the future is, we're using more and more services and labor that is in different parts of the world and pretty far away from where we are.
Right. But you agree that there are political tensions, and if they escalate, we don't know which effect's going to dominate, but certainly there is a risk of backlash in globalization. That, for example,
there's no question about that.
Yeah.
And that's exactly the whole institutional aspect that I was talking about. I mean,
Yeah,
I think the key issue is that, I mean, there's that, and then there's, of course, the other aspect of this is this renewed excitement for industrial policy, right? That in some sense, it also undermines the international trade and kind of the basic notion of globalization, which is, well, we all, specialize, we all have our comparative advantage, and so we specialize in those things, and we're not going to use the government to try to, specialize in other things and try to grab markets from each other. And so, the WTO has very clear, that's why the WTO has very clear rules on all of that.
Right.
This renewed emphasis on the need for industrial policy really kind of struggles with globalization and the institutions that were set up in order to foster that globalization process in the last few decades.
No, yeah, I agree. That's why I related to geopolitical issues, because I think once countries start to put like at the top of the agenda national security, they open the door for policies that may not be optimal based on some need for something that's hard to assess, at least using efficiency criteria. But
I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think the problem with obviously geopolitics is real, right?
Yeah.
And there is, a need to think about it and think about the different strategic position of the different countries, but it can also be co-opted to make selfish arguments by the different groups that we know are always trying to gain concessions from the government, right? And gain protection from international competition from the government. So this is, as old as market economies, right? There's always been the local producers that have tried to lobby for protection, right? And so they take that takes different forms. And so, of course, the key issue is to what extent can we really say this is about geopolitical interests, or is simply an argument that is being used by the groups that want protection, as
we agree, but that's why I want to go back to the origin of my question. Is I think I totally agree with you. We need to understand geopolitics. We need to understand the motivations, but also we need to talk from a normative point of view, right? We need to say, look, if we go this avenue, we will face all these costs. So again, given that you did research on the cost of deglobalization, so what will be the order of magnitude that you could imagine we can face if we go that path?
I mean, in terms of actual specific numbers, it really depends on what type of, how extreme is the event that we're talking about, right? I mean, when we talk about deglobalization, there's a component that is very narrow, which is to what extent is it super important that we trade different varieties of cars across countries, or different varieties of particular products across countries. So if you're a big country like the US, that there's going to be a cost, right? But the cost, and that these quantitative models of trade that have done these analyses, etc., put forward, is not that large. And because the elasticity of substitution between the different varieties that are being imported from Germany relative to what's being produced in the United States, it's relatively high, meaning that people are willing to substitute across products without a compensation that is particularly large. And so that leaves you with a few percentage points, right, in terms of cost of deglobalization, if, say, you impose tariffs of say the 10% maybe that the Trump, etc., are thinking about. So that's the kind of very basic. Some goods are going to be more expensive. We need to substitute across goods locally. I think more important is when we start thinking about, well, what are the cost advantages of having labor market specialization through offshoring, the knowledge diffusion that comes from supply chains. When we think about all the diffusion of knowledge and the potential growth that this can lead to, and the fact that specialization leads to innovation, then that's where you get the potentially much larger effects, the growth effects from the fact that countries retrench into their own economies and stop interacting that much with other countries. And so it's those growth effects, I think, that are the key. And if you bring in those growth effects, then of course the losses can be much larger. And so particularly, I mean, think about why is it that, say, Microsoft, I mean, I think there's actually a nice quote about Bill Gates making this point, which is that, the reason we invest what we invest, right, in all these technologies, is not because of our local market, it's because we have a global market, right? Because when we do this investment, we can sell these goods everywhere, right? Not just locally. And so those investments, I think that's where you really start getting the large potential losses from from deglobalization.
Yeah.
The fact that the markets get smaller, because markets get smaller, there's less investment in technology, because you can, investments in technology always have this feature, which is a fixed cost component, right? You invent it and then you can use it many times. That's the whole point of modern industrial production. And so, if that market is smaller, then the incentives to innovate are smaller, which leads to smaller growth effects. And there, it's very hard to be super precise about what those costs are going to be, but we know that they're going to be kind of an order of magnitude larger than the pure allocative effects that come from being able to or not able to consume or certain products from other countries.
Right. Let me stay within spatial economics, but switching to climate change, which is a spatial phenomenon. So, as we know, it's likely that the costs will not be equally distributed. The cost of climate change will be larger in the equatorial latitudes, but will be benign effects at northern latitudes, right? So the immediate implication of this is that humanity could adapt to the economic consequences of climate change by shifting the location of economic activity. So what I wanted to ask you is, what does it take for humanity to make this adaptation?
Yeah. So there's different types of forms that adaptation can take, and different mechanisms through which that adaptation takes place. So the first, as you pointed out, there's the natural phenomenon of climate change actually is itself distributed unevenly across different parts of the globe, in the sense that 1 extra degree Celsius of a world temperature increase in average world temperature has a differential impact in different locations. And that impact is actually larger in the poles or regions close to the poles than in these equatorial regions. So that's a kind of one source of heterogeneity, kind of the local temperature change that comes out of an average increase in temperatures in the world is differential and is larger closer to the poles. Then there is another characteristic, which is that when you estimate, and so that now this requires a model and requires some estimation. So now, we're going to, and that of course requires some methodology and assumptions, etc. But let me set that aside for a second. When you estimate the impact of temperature increases at the local level across locations, what you find, or what we found in different studies, is that the impact of a local increase in temperature on kind of the fundamentals of that location, namely its productivity or its amenities, namely, how much people like to live in that particular location, it's very severe when your baseline temperature is already very high, so as in the equatorial regions, but it's actually, and then as that baseline temperature increases, it goes to 0, and then it switches, and it actually becomes positive, right? So at some point, if you're a very cold region, if temperatures increase, well, you're more amenable and you're more productive, right? And so that switches. And so that obviously implies then that as temperatures increase, right, the impact is going to be differential, as you said. And then one obvious form of adaptation that comes out of that is, well, we can move to the regions where that are becoming better, right, and leave the regions that are more are affected more negatively. Now, of course, that's easily said than done, in the sense that, people have to actually physically move in order to avoid those costs. Now, sometimes that movement is fairly local, in the sense of, so if we think about, extreme weather events, or if we think about flooding, if we think about that type of impact, then the movement is relatively local. To the extent that it's local, it's easier. And I think that process it happens relatively smoothly. That doesn't mean that there's no cost. There are costs, of course, and so the cost of climate change ultimately is very much tied to what are those costs of moving, right? But it's, those costs are not that large either. Now, then there is, of course, the broader perspective, which is to say, well, if we take everyone in India and we move them to Siberia, then, we're going to be fine, because Siberia is going to get warmer, but that's actually good for Siberia. But of course, moving all the people from India to Siberia is not just about moving costs. It's also, that requires a full regime change, right? I mean, this requires a whole new geopolitical configuration of the world. And so the question is, what's the cost of generating that? And can we really estimate that from the type of evidence that we have so far? So we've done the work that we've done. It's introduces these migration costs to try to think about how costly is that form of migration, introduces some congestion costs in the destinations to think about the fact that, it's not that easy to just pack people in one place, and there's kind of backlash associated with that, etc. And then, and so with that, and then kind of the last part of that is also we want to give it an opportunity in the following sense, right? So if I look at the map of the world today, and say I look at Greenland, right? So Greenland is obviously, there's lots of land there, but there's not that much economic activity there today, right? Partly because it's very cold. And so we can think, well, why not, people could go there and develop it if it gets warmer. But then we want to also give that a chance. And the only way to give that a chance is to allow the local productivity of those places to evolve endogenously, right? To improve as a result of people moving there and, developing those areas and having ideas there and sharing and that knowledge, and putting production and modern production to work in those places. And so we want to also have this kind of endogenous formation of these clusters that lead to also, concentrated high productivity in some of those places. Because of course, if you just simply take the current distribution of productivity in the world, those places is not that large, as evidenced by the fact that there's not that much production happening there. And so what that implies ultimately is that if you don't allow for that kind of endogenous productivity growth, then it's also very costly to push people into those locations, because those locations are just not such good places to produce. So it has different aspects. Some aspects are easier. The big geopolitical issue of, well, there's international borders, and, as more people move through these international borders, that can lead to backlashes and geopolitical changes in who governs those countries and who has a political stake at saying what happens in those countries, etc. That's the part that we haven't really incorporated, but it's kind of important to incorporate. Now, we're talking about very long-run processes, right? Processes that are going to take hundreds of years. And so there's also a question of how seriously do we really want to take the current configuration of geopolitics in the world when we're talking about something that is going to happen 150 years down the road. And so what my take on this, but it's admittedly an incomplete take, is, well, let's think about what are the fundamental economic forces that are going to drive this process. Let's try to think about that interplay and how that interplay, plays out. And then, think about political structures that, are going to be generated in response to those underlying economic forces, rather than try to guess the political configuration and how that's going to be a hindrance and try to model that. I'm sure that could be done, but it's not something that we have done so far.
Right, but one thing that we know from history is that when the receiving places benefit, even benefit immediately, right, from large flows of migrants, restrictions were much lower, right? Think about, I mean, when Europeans moved to America in the 19th century, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and overall, if you think about relaxing migration restrictions and migration costs, etc., overall in the world, I mean, all our estimates, I mean, including some in my work, etc., tell us, that can be really big. I mean, the world would benefit a lot from that. So yes, but of course there's also like a short term, long term, and then there is the, whether the short term gains are negative, but then in the long run there's positive gains, and then there is a redistribution aspect of who faces the losses versus the gains, and do we really have mechanisms to do the proper transfers across different parts of society, so that everyone joins in the gains. And I think the problem is that in many cases that has been very deficient. So that distribution of the gains has not been that good. And so there's clearly very important parts of society, throughout the developed world, that are saying, we don't want more migration, and this is a problem, and we want to stop this. And so even though all the evidence that we have, I mean, I think it's pretty consistent. I mean, it's not 100% consistent, but it's pretty consistent that migrants are pretty good for this economy, and they have been pretty good for this economy, certainly in the long run, and apart from specific cases. And so that just tells you about the lack of these transfer mechanism. There's, of course, the other important aspect when we think about migration, particularly when we think about these long-term processes, which is that the developed world has gone through its demographic transition, and so it's facing natality rates that are all below replacement. So, these are societies that are shrinking unless they allow for more immigration. So I think one of the big transitions that we're going to see in the next decades, it's going to be a switch from this backlash against immigration to a system in which countries are going to be fighting much more for immigrants and to attract immigrants because their own societies are shrinking.
Right.
And so that can change these dynamics quite a bit too.
Right. So let me stay with this topic, but move to a paper you did about not about adaptation, but about mitigation, which is the other big strategy with respect to climate change. And you have this very interesting but paper with a very surprising result. That is that essentially what you argue is that if you use a spatially integrated model, a carbon tax of, I think, around $40 per ton of CO2 when it's introduced by the US or Europe, will have a positive impact and welfare gains everywhere, right, in the world, or maybe not everywhere, but on average, or in the aggregate. So essentially, what are the mechanisms, and why this is not incorporated in the policy debate?
Yeah, no, I mean, so just to give a little background around it, it's so one of the reasons it has been very hard to implement climate policy has been that this is like a global externality. So carbon emissions are a global externality. It doesn't really matter who emits them. They mix in the atmosphere. They affect temperatures everywhere. And so when you have like a global externality like this, in general, what you need is some sort of coordination or some sort of pact across nations that says, well, even though you unilaterally have incentives to pollute, if we all let's stop doing it because that's better for all of us, right? So kind of similar to this WTO point that I was making before. I mean, it's kind of a similar type of problem. And so that kind of speaks to how complicated it is to create institutions that do this. And so, one option, of course, is for these countries to go on their own. So for the US or Europe to say, it's hard to create this multilateral institution in order to tax carbon or price carbon more generally. So let's go on our own. Let's do it unilaterally. But the problem with going unilaterally, or the perceived problem of going unilaterally, is that you're hurting your economy because you're taxing one of the inputs that in your economy. So your production becomes more expensive. And you're not really helping that much because firms are going to move to some other location where they're not being taxed, to some other country in the world where they're not being taxed. They're going to pollute anyway. So you're not really helping the environment that much, and you're hurting your economy. And so if you go unilaterally, that's very ineffective because of this type of leakage, right? Both carbon leakage and economic leakage, meaning things moving to other countries. So that's the core problem. Now, here's where where our paper comes in, which says, okay, but so let's think about now about imposing such a tax. And when you impose such a tax, like a carbon tax, what you're doing is you're taxing this input. But this input is not uniformly used across locations in space. There's some industries that use it more than others. And these industries are, like we've been talking about, they're more concentrated in certain places than in others. And so when you tax an input like this, you're also affecting the distribution of economic activity in space, because you're affecting certain places that specialize in certain industries more than others. Okay, and so the basic notion is that, well, then if I impose this tax that then affects the distribution of economic activity in space, and this distribution of economic activity in space matters for the performance of the economy, then there's a question of, well, am I doing it in a positive way or am I doing it in a negative way? Is this change in the distribution of economic activity that's going to come as a result of the tax something that helps the economy or something that hurts the economy? And what the result in this paper says is it's something that is going to help the economy. And so how does that work? It works because when I tax an industry that produces a tradable good, a good that can, it's exported to other places. One of the things that happens is I'm taxing this input, and then I take this input, and so that increases obviously the cost of producing that good, and that's partly, and this depends on what we call the trade elasticity. But it's not us, that's the world calls it the trade elasticity. that's partially passed on to my customers, right? So my customers are the ones that end up paying part of that tax. How much of that depends on, how elastic they are, how much do they substitute to other goods rather than my good, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I pass that on to others. Now, but the revenue of the tax I keep, right? I mean, the location that it's imposing it keeps it. And so if that location says, well, let me, rebate it back to the locals, then ultimately the location gains. Because I impose the tax, I tax everyone, including the foreigners. I get some, so the foreigners pay partly for the tax, and then I take all the revenue and redistribute it locally. And so that increases overall output in that location, as long as the tax is not so large that the distorted economy is so distorted that this mechanism is dominated by the distortion, right? And so that's where the size of the tax matters. If the tax is not that large, I can grow an economy in this way. It's, I'm hurting others, right, by doing that because they are paying it, right? But that mechanism is automatic through trade, and so what that says is, well, when the European Union sets up a carbon pricing mechanism and then redistributes it locally, then part of the increase in input costs is being paid by the rest of the world, by Europe's trading partners, right? And so in that sense, that limits the leakage, right? Because they are already paying for part of it. They're going to be paying for part of it. And so at the end of the day, that actually can grow the place that puts on the tax. And in this case, can grow the European economy, which then implies also that, more people are going to move to Europe, and there's kind of other effects or other reallocative effects across different regions in the world that ultimately are good for the world, because Europe or the US, when we do it for the US, are places that are productive places where if more of the world was to move into them, the world allocation of people would lead to higher welfare in the world. And so ultimately that ends up being a good policy, independently, and this is, I think, the interesting point, is independently of course, the dynamic effect that it's going to have on the temperature and climate in the world, etc. Right? I mean, that's the kind of original motivation for the carbon tax, of course. But independently of that and the benefits that may come out of that, what this says is this carbon tax essentially is acting like a good place-based policy that is encouraging production in the most productive places, in the industries that are more productive in these countries, and that leads to this immediate gain from the taxes. So it's like having a good place-based policy, a policy that foments production in the most productive places in these areas.
But if you separate it from the impacts on emissions and the impacts on climate, is that the optimal policy, or there is another
Clearly
policy?
not the optimal policy. There's another policy that would be the optimal place-based policy, right? So you could always engineer a policy that takes into account all these different externalities and interactions across locations, that it's better than this, that does it exactly right. But the reality is that we don't. That policy is not in place.
No,
right?
no, that's fine. I just want to.
So no, but you're right. You're right that it's clearly what's called a second best argument, right? I mean, which is we are in an inefficient allocation, and now we're doing policy in this inefficient allocation, and this policy now, even though we're doing it to prevent climate change, etc., it's also changing the effect of these other distortions and forces in the economy in a way that can be positive or can be negative, because that has not been optimized ex ante, right? So of course, you would want to optimize that directly, but the reality is that optimizing that those things directly is extremely hard and is not really done anywhere in the world. And so we live in a world in which those distortions are just flying around everywhere, right?
Right. Okay, to finish, let me shift to another topic you did research with, which shows that you work in really important areas, which is the topic of pandemics. And in a recent paper, you investigate how pandemics interacts with globalization. So how they interact?
Yeah, so what we wanted to think about is the extent to which globalization is creating this type of more common pandemics, right? Or maybe not more common, but I mean, at least, this was in response to the COVID-19. And so, this seemed like something that some of us at least were not expecting and maybe thought would not happen. But the extent to which globalization is affecting this, and the main mechanism that we thought about was, well, think about trade and the world trade system, and now think about the fact that when you have trade relationships, when you are buying from other countries, etc., that's going to require some form of face-to-face interaction. You have to travel to the country, they have to travel here or whatever in order to create the trade relationships that you're building, and whether that then is going to lead to more. I mean, it's naturally going to lead to more interactions, and then those interactions in turn are gonna potentially lead to more infections if there is some virus or some form of disease floating around that can be transmitted human to human. And so that's the basic context, is that think about that relationship between trade on one hand and in the travel that leads to, and then the transmission of this type of disease. And so one of the things that is kind of interesting about that is, well, to what extent then, as I reduce trade costs, so if I reduce trade costs in an economy where we are modeling this type of interactions, does that lead to more or less or a higher or lower probability of this type of pandemics? And what we show is that it doesn't have to be necessarily positive. So it's not necessarily the case that you always have more pandemics. And the reason is that you're also, the way pandemics happen, right? I mean, you have like a country that there's a local infection, and then there is this international infection that is also happening. And so there's a balance between international interactions and the local interactions. And once you trade more with the rest of the world, it's true that that allows those international interactions that can lead to more infections across the world, but you also interact less locally, right? And so that implies that those interactions also become less intensive. And so the question is, what is the balance between those two things? And so at the beginning, if globalization is not super developed, the transport costs are not very, very low, then you can have that decreases in transport costs actually lead to a lower probability of pandemics rather than a higher probability of pandemic, because in some sense you are also importing some of the good health environment of the country that you are interacting with. it doesn't have to be the case, and so there's different types of scenarios. And part of the work that we've done is to think about when do you get one or when do you get the other. And then, of course, this is all potentially affected by the extent to which individuals then are responding or not to the notion that they understand that pandemics can happen, and that therefore my willingness to interact with you is going to depend on, that probability that I'm going to get sick in response to this, etc. And together with the price signals that this implies to. So if we trade less or more, to what extent does that affect our terms of trade? And through the terms of trade and changes in prices, my incentives to trade with you. And so the point is to kind of try to think about all those different combinations, and I think the issue there is that ultimately it's very nuanced. This relationship between globalization and pandemics is not just simply, perhaps in kind of more naive way that I'm including myself, I started with, which is just more globalization, more pandemics, is straightforward, right? That this is kind of more complex than this, and part of that research goes into that nuance.
Right. Right, Esteban, thank you very much for your time, for the conversation. It was very informative, and it was a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me, and thanks for all the interesting questions and conversation.
Okay, bye.
Bye.